so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets went low, the bombs burst in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Welcome, Sublation Media viewers, to the inaugural day Sublation Magazine stream. I'm Douglas Lain, author of Bash Revolution, After the Saucers. According to Twitter, I am also a sycophantic coward, as I am accepting that Trump is the president as of today. With me is Benjamin Studebaker. Benjamin, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, it's me, Benjamin Studebaker, did a PhD in Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge, author of a couple of books, Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies, out this past fall, and The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, out in 2023.
Right. And so today we're going to be discussing something kind of ancillary to the inauguration, which is this recent New York Times interview with Curtis Yarvin, and the prospects for the incoming president to be our monarch, or as Kamala Harris said, a dictator. So we're going to examine just how dictatorial we can anticipate Trump to be, but also what it would mean for the president to take on the role of the monarch, and just how un-American, or perhaps American, that might be. But Benjamin, before we dive in, I want to show some footage from the inauguration. Donald Trump is just arriving, and I thought I'd run a clip from that right now. So here's this.
You expecting somebody?
Yes.
Oh, Your Excellency, we've been expecting you. As chairwoman of the reception committee, I extend the good wishes of every man, woman, and child of Fredonia.
Never mind that stuff. Take a card.
Card? What'll I do with the card?
You can keep it. I've got 51 left. Now, what were you saying?
As chairwoman of the reception committee, I welcome you with open arms.
Actually, okay, that was a clip from the Marx Brothers movie Duck Soup from 1933. Groucho becomes president, not of the United States, but of a fictional country called Fredonia. I think we're supposed to think of it as the United States. And I just felt like there's something of the spirit of Trump in that clip. But how are you feeling today, Benjamin, as Trump is inaugurated?
About the same as any other day, really. Doesn't make much of an impact on me in terms of feelings.
Really? I'm feeling upbeat today. I just now noticed, like, as I ran the semi-sarcastic Star Spangled Banner, and then a clip from Groucho, and duck soup, I realize that some part of me is taking great joy in this moment. Maybe it's what is the term, the German phrase? Not Schadenfreude. No, help me out. Is that it? Schadenfreude?
Are you taking pleasure in other people's suffering?
Yes, I think it might.
Okay, then yes, that would be Schadenfreude.
The Schadenfreude. Yes. As I watch people on Twitter act out and act like the sky is falling, I feel a bit of Schadenfreude. That's the word I'm looking for. But you're immune to that.
It's hard for me to believe that anybody takes it as seriously as they did last time, because we've all seen it before.
Yeah. Have we though? I mean, the first time around, it was a surprise, and because it was thought to be a fluke and it was wrong, it was a mistake, people were reacting in this big way. But we had 4 years of Biden and quite a lot of effort to undermine Trump further that only seemed to propel him forward. And after all of that, after what I think to be lawfare, the attempted censorship of the internet, the vilification, and also a kind of a realignment of the Republican Party that kind of was perpetuated forward. It's a little bit closer to being complete now, it seems to me, at least in and around the executive. It doesn't quite seem like it's the same moment or even necessarily the same Trump, but
in some ways, I think the Republican realignment is further behind than in 2016. Can you imagine in 2016 Marco Rubio getting a job in the administration?
No, but that's only because he had just run against Trump and said some nasty things about him and about his endowment.
But do you really think that Marco Rubio's politics have changed? That Jeb Bush lapdog, do you really think he's altogether a different person? I look at this and go, back in 2016, nobody really had any clue what was going to happen. There was this thought that perhaps this meant that neoliberalism was dead. And now, of course, this is raised again. But I'm not convinced yet that anything fundamentally is going to change. I know that is not the view that everybody wants to have. Everybody wants to make it out to be a great big thing and say that either it's going to be wonderful or it's going to be terrible. But I'm really waiting to see hard evidence. What I noticed in the first Trump administration is that he was the least popular when he was actually doing stuff. When he did the tax cuts and he tried to repeal and replace Obamacare, that's when his poll numbers were the lowest. And then when he wasn't doing very much and he was just getting nitpicked with those impeachment trials and all that corruption gobbledygook that people were throwing out there, then his numbers went up because he looked like this outsider figure who was embattled.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we'll see something similar here. I think the policy itself, if he's actually permitted to do things, will be not very exciting. And then it's if they prevent him from doing things and they make him appear to be this outside threat, that he will take on this character of seeming interesting. He can only seem interesting when he does nothing. As soon as he starts to do things, he becomes boring.
Well, I think that there are some things that he might do that would be more than boring. For instance, we talked about Kash Patel yesterday in the Sublation Reading the Left podcast, which will be out for patrons soon.
That book depressed me.
Did it?
Yeah, because it's just Warrenism, but for the FBI.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think to talk about Warrenism for the FBI is it seems to me there's a different quality to that than Warrenism for the banks. I mean, the idea of exposing the corruption of the FBI seems to me to be more risky, and might have the potential to stoke the flames of dissent more thoroughly than some boring meeting on.
I remember a
regulating the
time when
banks.
we were going beyond corruption narratives, when we were talking about structures, and where they had to pretend that their corruption narratives were big structural change because we were trying to demand stuff. And now it's like, oh, wouldn't it be a big deal if they went after corruption? I remember not so long ago going, that Warrenite corruption stuff, that's not real change. And now it's like, wait a minute, this would be going after the swamp creatures. I mean, didn't he run on cleaning out the swamp creatures the last time? That wasn't nearly as big a theme in this campaign as it was the last time. Part of what got him elected was, you've been doing this for 30 years, Hillary. We have to drain the swamp. All of that. There isn't nearly as much of that this time around.
Well, yeah, I think that, well, let me just speak from my personal experience for a minute on the left. What happened over the last 4 years is that the left that was calling for structural change ended up being the left that would be apologetic for and even cheerlead corruption. And that it turned out that the calls for structural change often enough were just feeding into empowering and emboldening the most corrupt aspects of our government. So a government that wanted to shut down all political dissent and close down the space for political organizing and opposition. So because the left's failure or accommodation to the Democrats over the last 4 years, going after corruption, for instance, the corruption of Anthony Fauci, who just recently was pardoned, seems to me it could end up having more of an effect in terms of structural change than, say, pursuing regulatory reform with the aim of structural change.
Well, I certainly agree with you that the left has regressed into this enormously conservative force that thinks largely in terms of nations now and has no real horizon of possibility. That's definitely the case. But I do think that in 2016, there was a horizon of possibility and of discussion that has been largely lost now and is increasingly memory hold and forgotten. The sense of possibility people had for that term, the 2016 to 2020 term, was really destroyed. And it was destroyed both by the left returning to the Democratic Party, led by Bernie Sanders, who abandoned any pretense of radicalism and sheepdogged the left back into the Democratic Party, and by the people who came after Bernie Sanders in that movement, who were even less creative in terms of their approach. And then also at the same time, we had this COVID pandemic, which kicked up inflation, produced this housing crisis, this cost of living crisis, and caused people to become focused on just being able to pay for very minimum things. Can I get a stable job? Can I buy a house? And this is a great falling of expectations. A lot of people now would be content to just be able to have children and get to spend some time, any amount of time with them. Mm-hmm. People are really not looking for very much now. It's become very small, at least to my eyes.
Yeah, and yet, the promise is a golden age. We're going to colonize Mars. We're going to revitalize the U.S. economy and become.
Oh God! Can you imagine? Can you imagine if in 2016 either the Trump people or the Bernie people had talked about buddying up with Elon Musk to try to go to Mars? How we would have, right and left, regarded this as a total lack of interest in the real problems that people face. Mm-hmm. We would have been completely disgusted by Elon Musk's involvement in either the Trump campaign or the Sanders campaign in 2016 on that basis. This would have been oligarchic capture. We would have talked about, the three people who donated $100 million to Trump and their politics: Adelson, Musk, and Mellon, the finance guy. We would have been focused on that. We would have been talking about the political economy of the movement. Now what do we got? Now we just have a bunch of Democrats making these lazy Curtis Yarvin arguments.
Yeah, well, let's go into the Curtis Yarvin, because I think it does speak to the question of structural change and what it would, and whatever promise Trump might actually be able to fulfill going forward. Along with reading Kash Patel's book for the last left reading the Left podcast, we also read Woodrow Wilson's 19th century essay on the administrative state and a brief history of the FBI. And when we're talking about structural change, I mean, there's the structure of political economy, but there's also just the structure of the federal government and the way political power is distributed. So I have just a few clips from the Yarvin interview, but I think there's a lot to discuss in it. To begin with, he is a champion of monarchy, or the monarch, or of dictatorship, but he is a champion of that on the basis of the fact that a monarch or a dictator is already built into the American political system. He says he compares FDR in this interview to a CEO for a startup, and he pointed to the final paragraph of FDR's final inaugural address as evidence. And that last paragraph reads as follows: "We do not distrust the future of essential democracy. The people of the United States have not failed. In their need, they have registered a mandate that they want direct, vigorous action. They have asked for discipline and direction under leadership. They have made me the present instrument of their wishes. In the spirit of the gift, I take it." So Yarvin characterized this as FDR telling Congress, "Give me absolute power or I'll take it anyway." He might also mention that the Founding Fathers debated whether there should be a single executive or an executive council. Hamilton argued for a single executive leader, as he wanted a strong, active, and responsible executive leader to enact the will of the Congress and tend to the interests of the nation. As Chris Catrone messaged me this morning and pointed out in his book, The Death of the Millennial Left, the U.S. president, quote, embodied the perfected Whig ideal of executive authority as envisioned by Locke and the English Glorious Revolution. That is, a revolutionary ideal of political authority. So anyway, what do you make of the idea that, in fact, the dictator or the monarch in the executive is already built into the American system, and that it was something that was arrived at as the Constitution was formed at the very outset of our country, and also that it was at various times that power of the executive has been fully grasped by previous presidents?
This is not what Curtis Yarvin actually thinks. Curtis Yarvin and the New York Times are helping each other to create an illusion that Curtis Yarvin has something to do with this MAGA movement. Both have an interest in connecting Curtis Yarvin to the MAGA movement. But if you've ever read the letter to the open-minded progressive that he wrote back in 2008, in that letter, Curtis Yarvin makes it very clear that he is a Jacobite, that he is opposed to modernity and to the Enlightenment, and that he is a supporter of the Stuarts. Restore the Stuarts, he says in that open letter. And then, at a later point in the series of pieces that he wrote, he pivots the argument and says that instead we should have a corporatist state, and that the shareholders should be people who are considered trustworthy. And he proposes pilots, people who fly airplanes because you trust them with your life, as the people who should be the shareholders in the state. And those people, in his view, should run the state in a way such that GDP increases. Now, that's what he proposes back then. Now, because he sees a possible opportunity in the MAGA movement, he's trying to skew his arguments in such a way that it looks as if it has something to do with the American project. But he's a Jacobite. His politics have nothing to do with the American Revolution. They completely predate it, totally and utterly. However, the New York Times has a great stake in connecting him to the Trump movement so that it can frame Trump as not American and as in some way part of the Enlightenment. So what he's doing is trying to resist the way in which the New York Times is trying to generate opposition to him. So in that interview, he's trying to make the case that his politics do have something to do with the United States and Donald Trump. The New York Times is also trying to make this case, but they want to characterize his politics differently. The New York Times wants to characterize it as it is, which is this Jacobite pre-Enlightenment thing, right? And if the New York Times would have its way, they would also draw your attention to the racism, which he has been involved with at various points of his life that's public knowledge, public record, right? He would like to whitewash all of that and reframe himself as in some way connected to America or Americanness. And the way in which this is being done at scale is that the argument is that Curtis Yarvin has a personal relationship or some kind of direct line of influence on J.D. Vance, and that J.D. Vance is the power behind the throne in a Dick Cheney, George Bush sense, or he is someone who's likely to win a power struggle within the administration vis-a-vis Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, or in 2028 or 2032, J.D. Vance will become president, and then at that point, this thing will come to its full flowering. The thing is, J.D. Vance is a very, very sneaky guy who changes his politics all the time and has convinced an enormous number of right-wing public intellectuals that they have some kind of direct line to him. A lot of people with quite different politics have expressed in public or to me at various points that they think that they have influence with J.D. Vance. Indeed, J.D. Vance appeared on the What's Left podcast after I left, when Amy Therese was running that show and taking it in a somewhat different direction from the direction that it was in when I was on it. He appeared on that show. And then, of course, a clip from that episode was used by the Harris campaign in their opposition research, which did the rounds on social media. So all kinds of games get played in relation to J.D. Vance and Curtis Yarvin. But I think we have to be very, very suspicious of attempts by the New York Times to draw a neat little picture about what MAGA is involving Curtis Yarvin. And we should bear in mind that both of these things, the New York Times and Yarvin, are using each other.
Yes, that seemed obvious to me as well. I also want to tell you that what I took from what you just said most of all was that you know someone who knows J.D. Vance, and by extension, then I have influence on J.D. Vance? Is that what you're telling me? No,
I have met someone at a conference who made this kind of claim.
Yeah. All right. But look, I have known of Yarvin for a long time. I've heard of the Dark Enlightenment in the past. I've heard rumor of his ideas. I think I even tried to read some of his work, but it always struck me that being against modernity was just profoundly delusional, and that there was no way to return to the kind of life that could support a true monarchical power or a feudal order or anything like that, and to try to create a political movement that would actually seriously head in that direction was just nuts and not worth worrying about. Ashley, by the way, is in the background here. She'll be throwing the comments on the screen as we go along. But if we just take Yarvin at face value in this interview, the things that you're pointing to, I think, arise anyway in the conversation. One of the things that's very obvious is that the interviewer is not actually interested in what Yarvin is saying, or in understanding his points, or in elucidating those points, or clarifying them. He is only presenting the villain of the week to the best of his ability, and that ability is, I think, rather minimal. But nonetheless, there's a clip here I'm going to run from the interview to kind of illustrate what the point I had just made about FDR being a kind of monarch already. And here it is.
So, did FDR absolutely actually take that level of power? Yeah, he did. And so there's a great piece that I've sent to, some of the people that I know that are involved in the transition. And it's a little diary entry describing a cabinet meeting in 1933. And what happens in this cabinet meeting is that Francis Perkins, who's the Secretary of Labor, comes in to this meeting and is like, here, I have a list of the projects that we're going to do. FDR personally takes this list, looks at the projects in New York, and is like, this is crap, I don't know what you're doing. Like, humiliates Francis Perkins in the Oval Office or wherever they're having their cabinet meeting. And then at the end of the thing, it's like everybody agrees that the bill will be fixed and then passed through Congress. This is just a picture of FDR acting like a CEO.
So I think Yarvin's description of FDR as CEO fits well enough, but if we want to look a little more closely at the moment, it turns out that this is just perfectly normal behavior for a president who is addressing his own cabinet. Francis Perkins, as the Secretary of Labor, was a member of the executive cabinet, and because the executive is not a council, but rather the presidency is a position held by a single individual granted executive authority, the cabinet members play an advisory role, perhaps like a king's court. The point Yarvin raises in his New York Times interview is that we have a confused understanding of how our government works, or at least that's what I took out of it. It would even be fair to say that the term democracy is intentionally confused in the public imagination. This is why the last election was supposedly about democracy. Biden would say again and again, democracy is on the ballot. Given that Biden was cognitively impaired and managed by his cabinet, what we could understand his administration is defending is the notion of the executive as a council. Further, it was a defense of the power of the executive agencies that have grown independent of the presidency itself. That is, democracy means that the CIA, the DOJ, FCC, Department of Labor, NASA, Social Security Administration, Consumer Product Safety Commission, Department of Homeland Security, and many other agencies should operate autonomously and continuously from president to president. These are agencies that are not answerable to the public except to the courts. They're not staffed by elected officials, and as Yarvin points out, if we take these agencies to be representative of democracy, then we are perhaps using the wrong word. The Biden administration was not attempting to protect democracy, but rather at protecting a kind of aristocracy that had grown up outside of and in opposition to the constitutional order. A powerful executive, on the other hand, operates well within the constitutional order. But then there's a question that still rises, which is, why does Yarvin call himself a monarchist and not a revolutionary Republican? And I have another clip that would illustrate that. But you've sort of already pointed out that he's no revolutionary Republican. He's no part of the American tradition. He is a Jacobite. He is against modernity, against republicanism, against what we think of as democracy. But do you agree with, if I were just to take him at face value, that I could draw these ideas out of what he was saying?
You could certainly draw those ideas out of what he's saying in that interview. Yeah.
Well, let me go on a little bit further. So it seems to me that the reason Yarvin is a monarchist is that he accepts Wilson's vision of an apolitical administrative state that directs society.
Well, that's not why he's a monarchist. He's a monarchist because he opposes the Enlightenment. Yarvin explicitly opposes the Enlightenment. And for him, some kind of corporatism is the best we can do. In this, he is with Hobbes. Because the argument that the state is a corporation or is like a corporation comes down to us through Hobbesian political theory. And of course, Hobbes defended the position of the Stuarts. Mm-hmm. So the corporation or the corporate form, the Commonwealth as an abstract corporate form, as a way of, in some way, doing the king, that is entirely consistent potentially with a Jacobite position.
So maybe I've reversed it. The reason why he accepts the administrative state in its current form and it doesn't actually seek a return to any kind of republicanism is because he's a monarchist and a Hobbesian. And
the king can do anything for him, right? And that is for him as it should be. But his position is not the median MAGA position. This is not what MAGA is. The New York Times wants to sell you on the idea that Yarvin is what MAGA is. But Yarvin is is doing something else that doesn't have a lot of tractability in American society or in American political life. Yarvin is not representative of the MAGA movement. These intellectuals who want to get rid of democracy are a very, very, very small piece of the picture. But always you will see the liberal papers, they will play up the centrality of these figures so that they can try to position Trump as a cancelable thing. And these guys can get very famous and they can do very well in terms of career by trying in some way to be representatives of MAGA for the liberals. But what all of this includes is the actual MAGA and the actual Republican voter and the people in Indiana, where I'm from, who voted for him and what they actually think and want, none of which will be revealed to you in a New York Times interview with Curtis Yarvin.
Right. Okay, that's true. Yeah, I mean, fair enough. He in no way represents the MAGA movement. I agree. And least of all does he represent the people who put Trump into office. That's clear as well. But it's nonetheless worth exploring the argument he tries to make, you know, and to the degree to which, well, I mean, for me, the
People
move
should
I
actually
love
read the open letter. They should actually go and read that. It's a very interesting document. And if people would go and read the open letter and see the reverse Althusser he does in support of this position, where he frames all of the professionals as having been constituted by a cathedral of progressive institutions. Yeah, there's an extraordinarily Foucault Althusser type thing going on with him that is fascinating to observe, which is why oftentimes in the academy, he's kind of framed as left postmodernism turned around. And it can be revealing to engage with him because it can illustrate some of the things that you may find troublesome about other perspectives that nonetheless come from people who ostensibly you're supposed to like or support. So it's, I think, very useful intellectually to engage with him. But this interview is not his intellectual work. It's not his real contribution. His real contribution is in his writing. And that's what people should be engaging with if they want to understand what he's up to. This is a different thing.
What does it mean to say that he's sort of a left postmodernism thinker, or a left postmodernist thinker turned on its head? What does that mean?
Yeah, so it means that there are a lot of mechanisms that Yarvin will lay out in these Mencius Moldbug pieces for how it is that progressivism is transmitted to people and people are subjectivized as progressives, that will remind you of, say, an argument a Foucauldian might make, or an argument an Althusserian might make, or arguments that might be made in the academy today in terms of structural power or intersectionality. But these arguments will instead be attributed to what he calls the cathedral, which is a group of different institutions which he claims have all been captured by progressives or dominated by progressives. And then for him, what's necessary is to destroy these things utterly, including the media, including the university system. All of these things, not only can they not be captured, they have to be destroyed because they have an intrinsic tendency to be captured by progressives. So it's necessary to destroy them and then make alternative institutions. And this is not altogether different, interestingly, from an argument Hobbes makes in Behemoth about the need to get rid of classical education and replace it with an entirely different educational form that's more compatible with producing compliant subjects who will recognize the absolute powers of the king. There's a whole lot of interesting things that are going on there that are extremely, extremely right-wing, but intellectually quite interesting and useful to potentially acquaint yourself with. But the trouble with the New York Times interview is that both of the sides are trying to convince people of things that are not true in that interview.
You know, when we were talking yesterday for the Reading the Left podcast, I mentioned that a couple years ago, I just, on a lark, took one of these free open university classes. It was on the history of progressive education and American education. Starting from, you know, the revolutionary period and through to today, but a lot of emphasis put on the early to mid 20th century part. And you know, I passed it, I think, but I don't recall everything from it. But I would say that the overall picture that I got was that the classical education dropped away in favor of progressive education, and that progressive education was about teaching life skills rather than critical thinking, and that the role of the educator changed from being one that was aimed at producing active participant citizens who had their own property, maybe in the form of farms and things, into creating the proletariat, into creating um, people who were adequately trained in trades and who could follow instructions and who were properly socialized to fit into cities and things along those lines. So, uh, you know, what you just described as Hobbes's view of what education should be doesn't strike me as being out of step with what the progressives were aiming at on a fundamental level. Am I missing something here? Or
Well, one of the great questions about all of modernity is, to what degree was it ever the Enlightenment versus to what degree was it always already very Hobbesian? And this is something that I think there's plenty of room for argument about. But I think we should bear in mind that the case for using the education system to make people into instruments of the state that can make it more efficient in various ways, who are scientifically minded and so on, but not necessarily thinking in terms of what's good or what's true, or what reason would involve beyond very narrow constraints in terms of survival, that's laid out in Behemoth. That's a very old view. It's not something that progressivism invented or that Wilson invented, or this is something that goes back quite a ways. And it's in part because the state was responding to the disorder of the late Middle Ages and early modern period, and trying to evolve new techniques, new ways of maintaining order in and amongst this environment where there was an enormous amount of disagreement about the things which people previously used to agree upon to a much greater degree. And so, of course, when you have spiraling disagreement, enormous amounts of disagreement, these kinds of arguments come back. And they do become something that you hear about that's part of the discussion. But that is not to say that at this particular juncture in the United States, Curtis Yarvin has succeeded in capturing the Republican Party or turning it into a monarchist authoritarian movement, or even a kind of Principate-style monarchist republic. We're not even talking about a kind of John Milton, you can have a king who is nonetheless got the backing of the people, Byzantine sort of situation. We're not even looking at that kind of thing in the MAGA movement, as far as I can tell.
Well, let me run the next clip from the next and last clip from the interview that I have here. Let's see if we can jump off from here. Here we go.
So the question of basically, is democracy good or bad, is, I think, a secondary question to, is it what we actually have? When you say to a New York Times reader, democracy is bad, they're a little bit shocked. But when you say to them, politics is bad, or even populism is bad, they're like, of course, these are horrible things. And so the thing is, when you basically want to be say democracy is not a good system of government, just bridge that immediately to saying populism is not a good system of government. And then you'll be like, yes, of course, like actually, policy and law should be set by wise experts and people in the courts and lawyers and professors and so forth. Then you'll realize that what you're actually endorsing is aristocracy rather than democracy.
So, I mean, I've heard of him talk about this talk of the cathedral before. I think he just listed all the high priests of the cathedral there when he was talking to the New York Times audience as to what he might be advocating for. He sounds like a representative of what he would call the cathedral there.
But to him, these people are not the actual experts, because to him, these institutions are full of people who are not actual aristocrats. And therefore, they all have to be purged and their institutions have to be destroyed. And that's the part he doesn't say.
Right. I mean,
and it's also, both sides of this totally estrange him from MAGA, right? The MAGA movement is not a pro-technocrat, pro-aristocracy movement. That's not what it is.
Right. No, of course not. But it does strike me that there's this fundamental agreement that he has with the New York Times audience, with the progressives, as he sees them, that there should be an expert class of managers and leaders who suppress the population and direct them, and that would be, and just like we were talking about a moment ago about the role of education. The role of education changes from producing independent-minded, critical thinkers who will be active participants in creating the future of a nation, and instead he wants to, we want to transform them into being compliant and obedient and servile and easy to instruct and direct, right? And that's it.
Yeah, there's a set of people here for whom the question is whose professions, and it's just a battle over who controls the oppression, the professions, and who controls which the institutional forms that they take. And it's a question of who gets the jobs, and this is about who gets the scraps off the plate. As the plate shrinks, and as the workers who are not even a party to this really are completely alienated from the whole discussion, who gets the scraps off the plate, and how should we decide who gets university jobs, which demographic categories or metrics are relevant, for deciding who gets jobs in the media. And the people who talk love to argue about this because it affects all of us directly and personally. We could all get personally involved with it, but it has so little to do with the basic problems that face the overwhelming majority of people, which are to do with the fact that they can't buy houses and the fact that things are constantly getting more expensive and the healthcare system doesn't work. And their jobs that they train for, they disappear, they go away, somebody else takes them, and they don't know what to do. And if this hasn't happened, they're scared that it will, because what on earth is going on with AI? How's anybody supposed to know what that's going to mean? How's anybody supposed to know with climate change and all these things, what the future holds? This is what people are really frustrated about. But none of it comes up at all when we get into this who controls the professions and imagining. There's this imagination that the professions constitute the subjects. So if you control the cathedral institutions, you can just make the workers and make the people believe whatever that you want because they don't think, only you think. And it's something he shares with those New York Times people. And it's something that is not about Trump, except insofar as the Trump thing is an Elon Musk thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that you and I are in total agreement here. But what I want to do is, I'm not that concerned about Yarvin, really, but I'm much more concerned about the actual opposition to the Trump administration, the never Trumpers, and the people like Charlie Sykes, who you interviewed at the convention, and David Brooks, along with the Democrats themselves. And again, this is an anecdote I told in the other podcast, but I'll bring it up again now. My youngest son is taking a writing class at the Portland Community College, and the first assignment they gave him, well, the second assignment they gave him, the first one that required reading, was a David Brooks essay from the New York Times, published in 2017, on the Enlightenment, one that was arguing that Trump was an anti-Enlightenment figure, and it argued that the reason why he was an anti-Enlightenment figure was because he was opposing the rational administration of society through the constitutional order, yes, but also through the administrative state, and through NATO and through the EU. And what dropped away from Brooks's conception of the Enlightenment altogether, as the essay went on, was the kind of conception that Kant had when he wrote What is Enlightenment, which was that it was a matter of developing your own independent reason. The idea that that the Enlightenment was a matter of maturity, and maturity meant thinking for oneself and not allowing anyone else, any expert, to tell you what to think, but to reason on your own accord. That idea has just dropped out of what a lot of people who are progressives would consider to be the Enlightenment, and I think it's dropped out of the right-wing reaction against the Enlightenment. It's forgotten by both camps at this moment, or from what you're describing, that's what it sounds like.
Yeah, it's because there's something objectively compelling about the Hobbesian way of looking at things. There is something objectively compelling about it. It's incomplete and it misses lots of things, but it also does grasp certain things that seem not to be grasped by other people who are making interventions. And that's why it has a certain tractability. And it will continue to be part of the picture. And it's something that we have to grapple with and reckon with. But I want to really make a point to say, because what's going to happen is that people who make any kind of argument that's complicated about Trump are going to be accused of being Yarvinites and having Yarvin's politics. That there is really a very, very meaningful difference between that view and a lot of the other views that people who support Trump in various ways have. The thing that I'm always looking to draw attention to with respect to Trump and the Republicans is that there is an enormous amount of diversity within that MAGA movement. And people who don't pay attention to the MAGA movement and Trump voters and who don't know people in the middle of the country, don't talk to people who don't have college degrees, these people don't know all of the different things that are going on. And the New York Times has an enormous power, not so much in terms of the United States, but in terms of how all of this is viewed around the world. Because people around the world think that the New York Times and the Washington Post are reliable ways of getting information about what goes on in the United States. And so people around the world need to know that this is not what this argument is all principally about. The Curtis Yarvin thing is not what we are principally fighting about in the United States right now. Right now, we're having a fight about bureaucrats versus electeds. We're having a fight about structure of the procedures of the administrative state and who gets the jobs. It is not some kind of monarchist thing. That's just something that particular intellectuals can entertain.
Right. So, and you want to point out that when Yarvin starts to sound like Chris Catrone, and because Catrone's like, oh well, I want to talk about Locke's conception of the executive, and it kind of echoes some of the things that Yarvin might have said in that interview. That shouldn't mislead us as to the character of the dissident aspect of the MAGA movement or of any American politics, right?
I would invite anyone who thinks that Yarvin has anything in common with Catrone to ask Catrone if Yarvin has anything in common with him.
Right. Of course he doesn't. Right?
I think Catrone would give a very lengthy and detailed, Chris would be able to say, and he would say in a way which would be most faithful to his own view, exactly why and how he's different. But I very clearly see an enormous amount of difference between Chris Catrone.
Right. It's the difference between Locke and Hobbes, right? I mean, in
it's no. It's much greater than that. It's much greater than that. Yarvin is engaged in a kind of total quixotic LARP that doesn't really have anything to do with contemporary politics, except for this fact that people are dissatisfied with democracy and so want some romantic visions of alternatives that they can daydream about intellectually. And he offers them an account which enables them to do that and feel like they're engaging in intellectual activity. Catrone tries to grapple with events meaningfully in their context. He tries to, in some way, talk about these things. He's not doing escapism. There are some people who are influenced by Chris that I think have failed to grasp some of the nuances and niceties of his argument, who engage in a certain 19th century quixotic LARP. But that's not what I take Chris to be doing.
Right. Do you think Yarvin is self-aware in terms of his own lack of seriousness and its disconnection from political reality, or do you think he's, imbibed his own Kool-Aid here and takes his own ideas seriously?
Well, if he's anything like me as a theorist, you vacillate between taking yourself seriously and wondering if you're full of shit. I think probably there are moments where he imagines maybe he might get somewhere with this, if not now, then in some great long period of time. And there are other moments where he feels like what he's talking about has nothing to do with what anybody else is interested in. I think all theorists have that experience at different points. And sometimes it can be in the same day. You know, in the morning, you feel like you're saying something that matters, and in the evening, you feel like you're wasting your life.
Yeah, it's like a terrible regression from Marx's idea that in the morning we can be farmers, in the afternoon we can be poets. Okay.
In the morning, we delude ourselves that we're accomplishing something, and in the evening, we despair and cry a lot. Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, I want to address one comment here, and then I want to talk about the short story we were going to discuss. I sent you a link, I think, to the E.M. Forster short story, "The Machine Stops," which is over 100 years old. But someone says, Doug, you always mention how the Biden administration tried to censor social media over the laptop. Well, I mean, they tried to censor and control all media, social media being part of it. And it was not just the Biden administration, but the Department of Homeland Security. And it grew out of the surveillance state that was built by George W. Bush. And you know, you can trace the attempt by the federal government to control sense making, you know, way back. But certainly the Biden administration did play an active role in all that. But you never mentioned the Trump administration also tried to send after killing General Soleimani. Well, I don't know what that means exactly, but
the Iranian general that was killed.
I know who he, but I'm not sure how that connects to the first part of the concept. But I will say
they're accusing you of running cover for Trump by only criticizing Biden. It's that kind of thing.
Yeah, but they're not the same. Like, okay, yeah, I have said and will repeat now that I think the targeted killing of General Soleimani was a violation of U.S. law and international law, and might have led to impeachment if we were going to be strict about these things. But as far as violating the Constitution and suppressing the public or civil society's right to politically organize and express political opinion both, there's no comparison between the two acts. And the amount of targeted killing from every president, including Obama, was high, and the violation of that law has been perpetual. But I would certainly oppose Trump's targeting General Soleimani and for assassination. That is against U.S. law and international law.
I would say I don't exist mainly to normatively criticize the things that people think I ought to be normatively criticizing. I exist to analyze what's going on, and I pick out the things that are most interesting to me and which I think say something that matters, and I talk about them. I do not exist as a vector for whatever normative frustrations people in the audience may have with particular things that happen. What must be grasped is that horrible things are continuously happening all the time. They're continuously happening all the time, and we have to decide and prioritize what to focus on and what to talk about. And these are decisions that are made on the basis of things that matter.
Right, but I would say of the things that Trump did as president, this one bothered me not just in terms of moral judgment, but also to the extent that he might be expanding the power of the state to go beyond the checks and balances that protected the citizenry. I mean, I don't want a federal government or an executive that feels that he can simply target individuals, whoever he wants, for killing extrajudicially, and that would include foreign leaders, or you know. So I do find it troubling. I don't want to minimize it.
Yeah, but people in the audience like to try to make intellectuals into their yapping dogs who have to talk about whatever it is that they think is important. And it's not up to people in the audience what Benjamin Studebaker or Doug Lain thinks is important.
Yeah, that's true. But I would just want to point out I had actually raised that in the past, and it's not as though I would not criticize Trump for that. But I understand your point. Let's talk about The Machine Stops for a bit now, because I feel like it might be an appropriate short story to read on Inauguration Day from a number of different directions. The first time I read this short story, I think, was in 2007. And it has a it played a key role in the formation of the Diet Soap podcast, actually, because at that time I was revamping my early 90s Kinko's zine and publishing it again, but through Lulu. And so the first Diet Soap, revamped Diet Soap zine, which was very short-lived, featured a reprint of The Machine Stops, which was in the public domain, by Ian Forster. And it was one of these short stories that was making the rounds in the science fiction circles at the time, because people were surprised at how close it came to describing what life was like online. That there was something about it that seemed extremely close to how we were all actually living even then in 2007. But just to fill in, to kind of tell the story, the Machine Stops is a story of a mother and son who are living in a future where everyone lives underground in artificial environments and kind of a catacomb of rooms and hallways, which is operated by and controlled by the machine. The machine pumps air into your rooms. It determines, and you can tell it what to do, but it determines the level of light that you have. It provides you with entertainment through screens and tubes and things. You can communicate with other people underground through this network of communication through the machine, and but people do not go above ground because it's thought to be, deadly, and they rarely visit each other in person either. They spend most of their time in isolation underground. And in the beginning of the story, it's the story of the mother's day, living under these conditions and the way she enjoys herself online in a way. And then she gets a message from her son, who she hasn't seen in many years, I think, and who tells her that he has some bad news for her. He's discovered something, and what he's discovered is that the machine that's keeping all of this working is breaking down. The machine is going to stop, so the Machine Stops is a story of how this comes to be, and the story of a rebel, the rebel son, as he discovers that you can go above ground without perishing, and that the machine is breaking down. That's the story of The Machine Stops. So, what did you make of it reading it today, Benjamin?
Yeah, there's a part of it I like, and then there's a part of it that I think compares unfavorably to The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, right? The part that compares unfavorably is the loss of any kind of class dynamic, right? Any kind of internal social, it's just man versus something external. And I've noticed that in general, as discussions of what we can do fall away, it becomes us versus something external that might get us in the future. Whether that's machines, or it's the planet, or it's the super volcano, or whatever it is that people happen to hook onto. There's a tendency to want to externalize our problems and make it something that comes to us from outside. At the same time, I am attracted to the critique of the loss of human activity in the story, right? Because this is not an anti-human story. A lot of contemporary stuff, which focuses on the limitations of technology, also attacks the human. But in this story, the human is vindicated, because what's necessary is for humans to do things and to think and to act and to engage with stuff, which is at least more than you see in some of the very anti-human fiction that comes out these days, like that new film Wild Robot, in which the problem with the machine is that it's been programmed by people and it just needs to learn from the animals. And then once it learns from the animals, it can do everything good and wonderful because the animals are in touch with nature. And all man is needed to do is to make the robot. And then once man makes the robot will eliminate the need for man, because it will somehow get in touch with the planet or with nature, cutting man out of the picture and leaving man to die. This is much better than that.
Well, what was remarkable about it in 2007 was that it seemed to be that the fact that it was almost 100 years old then, and that it seemed to be describing a very contemporary reality, that somehow it was worth being reminded that the feelings that we had, and the feeling of isolation, and the feeling that we were reliant on technology, this came up, this made the rounds after the Matrix and the sequel, and the that kind of vision had already come and gone. So people were struck by how prescient Ian Forster was in this story. But of course, that mostly illusion. None of the actual technology he describes came to be, and we don't travel around the world on airships, and and we do go outside, and we don't live underground. But nonetheless, there's something that strikes me as true about the story.
Yeah,
Also,
especially with respect to the digital subject, to the kind of
right.
hikikomori, always stays in the house. We've heard about this coming out of Japan. And back in 2008, there was, and even in the late 90s, Paul Krugman wrote a book comparing the potential trajectory of Western economies to that of Japan. There has been this image of this Japanese hikikomori who is stuck in the house and doesn't come out and doesn't go outside. And this question of, is that happening? And the charts that get distributed on Twitter about the Zoomer generation, which doesn't drink and doesn't date and doesn't have sex and doesn't do all sorts of things, doesn't work, summer jobs, doesn't do all sorts of things that historically have been more common, doesn't drive. Not to say that any of those things
don't
necessarily
wear pants.
should be done.
They wear pajama bottoms instead of pants. I don't understand. Anyway, go on.
They wear Crocs with socks. They do all kinds of things, right?
Right.
But this chart suggests that they do. The Zoomer generation does go out significantly less often than the millennial generation did, let alone Gen X, the boomers, and so on. And this is a digital kind of thing. Once you have a computer that's really a good time, it does change things. And as someone who was early to get a computer that was a good time as a youth, I recognize this. I had a different culture from people who were in the same age at the same grade as me, who were poorer, who didn't have computers in the home, or if they did, it was some old rotting box from a long time ago that belonged to the whole family. If you had one of those suckers in your room and you could close the door, you had a whole different society from people that you went to class with. It is really a significant thing.
Yeah. I think that the reason why this might be a short story to read today is because I do think that there's a certain vision amongst the MAGA set that what we need to do is destroy the machine and break free of it. The machine being the administrative state or the deep state or the progressives or the Democrats or the globalists or the World Economic Forum, or that this is a machine that's wanting to drive us all underground and keep us in under these kinds of conditions. And this is a story of hope for those who have that imagination today. Right?
And yet they so readily got into that silly argument about how to generate more computer scientists a few weeks back on Twitter. For people who are against machines, they sure argued hard about how to produce more computer scientists. They sure seem to think that's the future.
They're internally split. On the one hand, they are on the side of Ian Forster. On the other hand, they are on the side of Elon Musk, who wants.
But then there's also the chunk of them that just they don't care if there's more machines as long as they're American machines. As long as the computer scientists are American citizens, they don't care.
Yeah. No, look, there's a lot of stupidity out there. I do think that I don't quite understand the nativism in this moment. I do understand to a degree where it's coming from because of the emphasis on immigration that was in the campaign, but the kind of deep nativism that is being directed towards J.D. Vance by his own base is kind of disgusting right now. I saw a post about him having a Indian wife that this morning that I found I found it disgusting and backwards.
When you make it so that people can't do basic things or things that until recently were considered basic, they react very, very strongly and in ways that are not necessarily good for any kind of emancipatory politics. So if you create a situation where people struggle to buy houses or support having children, this can lead people to thinking they're trying to replace us with immigrants. It could produce extraordinarily reactive modes of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
It's a consequence of COVID and the way that COVID was managed economically, the costs that imposed, and the ways that those costs subjectivize people.
Right. Well, listen, we've been talking for over an hour. I'm going to go refill my coffee. I always just live off coffee all day, and then around 20 minutes we'll start the Parrot Room, where we're going to be discussing a Hal Draper piece and a piece by Karl Kautsky, but we can also discuss the inauguration. And I look forward to people joining us there. I want to remind everyone that supporting us on Patreon is really what allows this to continue, and we do need your support. We're also introducing discussion groups like the one we do with the Sublation magazine show for all of our podcasts. So if you watch any one of our podcasts on YouTube, you could go to Patreon and then discuss it with very smart people. People are often smarter than the people on the podcast. So come and join us on Patreon, and I look forward to seeing you there today. And I'm going to close with the Star Spangled Banner just as I opened, because it's that day. It's the day when we're all Americans. Here we are.
Oh, say